Hello everyone, and welcome to our lecture series for Chapter 21 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This chapter is The New Deal, 1932 to 1940. This first section is entitled The First New Deal. The focus question for this first section is, what were the major policy initiatives of the New Deal in the first 100 days? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, otherwise known as FDR, ran for president in 1932 on the Democratic ticket, and he promised a new deal for the American people, but this new deal had very few specified aims. However, Americans in general were desperate for new leadership after the failures of the Hoover administration to respond adequately to the Depression, and the Democrats won a sweeping majority in Congress as well as the White House in 1932. Roosevelt conceived of this New Deal as an alternative to socialism on the left and fascism on the right. He was trying to plow some sort of middle ground between those two, but most of his initiatives that became a part of this New Deal certainly leaned more towards the left than the right, or even in the middle there. And this was very much a reaction to the failures of the Hoover administration and its more conservative response to the Depression. Roosevelt did not enter office with a blueprint. Instead, he relied on experts whom he placed in key government positions to design this New Deal in piecemeal fits and starts. He was determined that the government should manage and direct large firms rather than simply breaking them up into smaller companies. Just to illustrate how much Americans were ready for a change in 1932, this is the electoral map of the 1932 presidential election. And as you can see, the Democrat Roosevelt won by a landslide victory in both the electoral and the popular vote, with the Republican Hoover only having a small enclave up here in the Northeast that went his way. One of the first things the incoming Roosevelt administration had to do was to confront a collapsing banking system, and his administration right off the bat put forth several pieces of legislation that sought to address this issue. One was the Emergency Banking Act, which provided funds to help support failing banks. One was the Glass-Steagall Act, which barred commercial banks from buying and selling stocks, separating commercial banking for the consumer with investment banking. He also established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which insured individual people's accounts from a bank's failure. He also took the United States off the gold standard, which allowed the government to print more money and put it into circulation to help alleviate some of the debt problem. The first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration was a period of an unprecedented flurry of legislation that rapidly expanded the role of the federal government in business and in Americans' lives. One of the more significant pieces of legislation during this period was the National Industrial Recovery Act, which established the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. And the NRA worked with business leaders to set standards, set prices, and set working conditions. And it also recognized workers' rights to organize unions, something that business leaders were still pushing back against very hard. The NRA was extremely controversial, and it did not produce economic recovery or peace between employers and workers. The Roosevelt administration also sought to address the problem of chronic unemployment in the first 100 days, and to do that, they established several new agencies. One was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which provided direct relief to the impoverished. Another was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which set unemployed men to work for the government on various public works projects around the country, including improving national parks. Speaking of public works projects, the Roosevelt administration set out on an unprecedented effort to support and promote public works projects around the country in efforts to not only put people to work, but to improve and modernize the country's infrastructure. They established the Public Works Administration, which contracted directly with private companies to build public facilities. Many of the public facilities today, like schools and gyms and things like that, that were built by the Public Works Administration during this period. The Civil Works Administration hired workers for construction projects of various sorts across the country. The Tennessee Valley Authority built dams in the Tennessee Valley region and provided cheap electric power for the first time to millions of Americans in the Appalachians. The Roosevelt administration also sought to deal with the issues plaguing agriculture in this period, and one of the things they did was they passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, with authorized production quotas and actually paid farmers to produce less with the hope of lowering the supply and thus raising farm prices. It did work to raise farm prices and incomes for some, but it did not benefit the sharecroppers, which especially in the South was still a significant portion of the farmers in that region. The farmers in the Midwest were hit with an additional crisis in this period, this one of an environmental nature, as the Dust Bowl gripped the Midwest, and this was an effect of the most severe drought in the Midwest in decades, if not longer, coupled with harmful farming practices that were begun during the late 1800s with the rise and spread of mechanized farming. And these mechanized farming practices basically stripped the layers of topsoil to basically nothing and turned them into a fine dust. And when high winds would whip up in these prairie regions, huge clouds of dust would amass and sweep over the landscape, covering everything in their path. The Roosevelt administration also established the Resettlement Administration, which sought to relocate families, particularly those affected by the Dust Bowls, to planned communities and set up relief camps for migrant workers, particularly out west. The Roosevelt administration also sought to address the issues in the housing industry in this period. The American housing industry was devastated by the cessation of construction at the onset of the Depression and the foreclosure on thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of homes across the country. The Roosevelt administration established the Homeowners Loan Corporation to provide direct loans to Americans for the purposes of buying homes. And they also established the Federal Housing Administration, which sought to assist the impoverished with finding housing. It actually became cheaper at this time for Americans to buy houses than to rent. Other achievements of the first New Deal included the repeal of the 18th Amendment with the 21st Amendment. The 18th Amendment, of course, was the prohibition of alcohol, and the creation of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, which sought to regulate the stock market. The first New Deal overall was a series of experiments that transformed the role of federal government, constructed public facilities across the country, and provided direct relief to needy individuals. Despite some significant successes of the first New Deal, there were many Americans who thought that Roosevelt was going too far and veering too far left into the socialist aspect of politics and government policy. And beginning in 1935, a conservative Supreme Court, many of the court members at this time had been appointed during previous Republican administrations, began to invalidate key New Deal laws as unconstitutional, beginning with the NRA and the AAA, the National Recovery Administration, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The NRA, according to the Supreme Court, delegated legislative powers to the president and attempted to regulate businesses not engaged in interstate commerce. And this goes back to the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which says that the only powers the federal government has to regulate any trade or economic activity is for foreign trade or trade between the states, not trade within the states themselves. The AAA, according to the Supreme Court, was unconstitutional because of the use of congressional power over local economic activity, again infringing upon that Interstate Commerce Clause in the Constitution. That concludes part 1 of our Chapter 21 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.